If you've been following along, a few weeks ago I made a full set of Regency undergarments based on historical sewing manuals and items in museum collections. Those 3 pieces, a chemise, a pair of short stays, and a bodice petticoat, were all made in preparation for wearing this gown. First, I had to start by drafting my pattern, so here I've got my dress form with all the layers of undergarments already on it. I wanted to go with this style here, which is from a French painting that I'm not going to bother pronouncing, painted in 1818. Because sewing patterns in this period were mostly drafted and used by tailors and dressmakers, this was before the invention of paper sewing patterns in magazines or in envelopes, I decided to draft the pattern myself as well, instead of going with a modern commercial option. A few style details that I definitely wanted to keep were the arm side cut deep into the back and the shoulder straps that extended past the shoulder point into the back of the bodice. Though the shorter, more comfortable styles of stays that reached their peak popularity around the late 1810s did not aid in this effect, both of these styles are reminiscent of the cut-on 18th century gowns, which worked in conjunction with 18th century stays to draw back the shoulders. So even though the emphasis on posture didn't affect the fashionable silhouette as strongly in the Regency era, evidence of it still remains. As you can see, the waistline on my petticoat sits slightly below the waistline on the gown, as to prevent bulk at that point. I didn't bother fitting the bodice so closely at the waist, since it was going to be gathered anyway, and I also extended the front piece quite far into the side back, similarly to how gowns from this period were cut. I added some width for gathering to both the front and back pieces. Since my reference image obviously didn't show the back of the gown, I copied the typical Regency gown back, which is lightly gathered at the neckline and it draws into tighter gathers at the waist. Before I get started on the sewing, I just wanted to say, this dress was really easy to make. Like, there were a couple challenging parts of making the undergarments, but the dress itself took like 4 days to make and it wasn't really challenging at all. So the fabric I chose for this project was a very fine cotton and silk blend. Dresses made of this sheer cotton lawn peaked in popularity in the first few years of the 1800s, but remained pretty common until the 1820s. In portraits and fashion plates, they tend to have this transparent shimmer to them, so I thought the silk blend might help achieve that. In total, I have, count them, 3 pattern pieces to cut out: the bodice front and side, the bodice back, and the sleeves. I also had to cut some skirt panels, but I didn't bother with pattern pieces for those because I could always adjust the fit by changing the amount of gathering. So I started with a 2-gore skirt, one for the front and one for the back, the waist measurements of both pieces adding up to my waist measurement. Then I cut 1 more gore identical to the others, and so 2 gores will gather up into the space of 1 for the back. This sort of skirt shape, with a flat front and a tightly gathered back, is the standard for the Regency era. I wanted to make sure that when I sat, you could see the fabric from the back being drawn to the front like in portraiture from the period. So first I sewed the bodice together, the curved side back seams and the lowered shoulder seams. This is so different from how we construct clothing today. Using these style lines, I'm not sure how you would go about making fit alterations like you can using the modern side and shoulder seams. Next, I marked a bunch of areas for adding gathering threads. In total, I added them to the top and bottom edges of the front of the bodice, the top and bottom edges of the back of the bodice, and the top and bottom edges of the sleeves. I mentioned this in my last video, but on this project I sewed all my seams by machine. I tried to incorporate historical techniques as much as possible, but the dress was pretty basic, and it's not like there's a specific set of instructions to follow like with the undergarments. Still, I referenced several garments from museums to get a sense of how it would be constructed. After putting in all the gathering threads, I began working on the sleeves, first by sewing them into a tube. This is the same sleeve pattern as I used on the bodice petticoat, just shortened slightly for a more puffed look. Then I set the sleeve into the armhole, using the gathering threads to help me. I'll bind the bottom edges of the sleeves later once I bind the neckline. The bodice was now fully constructed, so I started with the skirt. I kind of lied before, it's actually a 5-gore skirt, not a 3-gore, because I had to do some piecing on the 2 back panels. On the final dress, the skirt is so voluminous at the back and has great movement to it. At some point I'll widen the petticoat. If you remember from the last video, it was slightly too narrow, so that I can really take advantage of the fullness of the outer skirt. Of course, you can't think about Regency fashion without thinking about Jane Austen. So far, I've read Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, and Persuasion, and I think I like Pride and Prejudice the best because the characters are both likable and comedic. The secondary characters in Sense and Sensibility don't really feel as real and are kind of one-dimensional, and I like Persuasion, but it's a little slow in the first half. But so far, I'm thoroughly enjoying the Austen books, and the only thing that would make them better is if there was more fashion in them. Anyway, next I added the double rows of gathering thread to the skirt at the back. And I pulled all the gathering threads at the waist on the bodice and the skirt to match with my waist measurement. Then I pinned it together and sewed. Next I bound the neckline and the sleeve cuffs, so I cut several lengths of fabric just over an inch in width. I thought the binding would be narrow enough so that I could get away with cutting them on the straight grain, but I really should have used the extra fabric to cut them on the bias. The only part of the dress that looks unprofessional is the wrinkling on the neckline binding because I didn't use the natural stretch of the bias. I put the gown on my dress form with all the layers of undergarments underneath and tightened the gathering at the neckline in preparation for binding. Then I pinned the binding to the right side of the dress. I was so annoyed. I pieced and cut another strip of binding just for the original piece to be barely long enough, so I had to remove the extension. Then I stitched that to the neckline. I was looking at a few museum garments, and I saw one with a construction that I thought would work well. So I braided 2 cords using cotton crochet thread, one for each side of the back, and I'll stitch those into the binding so that the dress can tie shut at the back. They're anchored into the side back seams with a few back stitches within the seam allowance. Then I cut off the excess seam allowance before turning the binding to the inside of the gown and felling it down. I'm gonna be honest, I really like it when projects have a bit of monotonous hand sewing to them. I'd never be able to be a modern seamstress where seams are serged and everything is done by machine. Don't get me wrong, I only occasionally tack down my facings and I hate sewing on closures, but I do really like easy and repetitive felling. I could have added an eyelet for the ties to emerge from at the back of the dress, but I figured it wasn't going to get much wear and it wasn't worth the bulk that it would add, so I just separated the fabric with a yarn needle and used a crochet hook to pull the tie through. The raw edge beyond the unfinished eyelet hole will be turned and felled later. I decided where I wanted the slit in the back to end and sewed the skirt below that point, and this is how it looks so far. Next I evened out the hem, using my hem gauge to actually make a hem for perhaps the first time ever. My reference photo has a beautiful blue ribbon waistband, and having contrast waistbands is relatively common in dresses and portraiture from the period, so I decided to add one as well, using the taupe-colored silk from the stays. I made a tube, then used a safety pin to turn it inside out. While sewing it to the back edge, I also added 2 sets of hooks and eyes. If you'll notice, there are only 2 closures on this dress, the hooks and eyes at the waist and the ties at the top edge, which matches this Regency dress from the Met. Then, a day or so later, waiting for the skirt to stretch along the bias, I did the double fold hem after evening it out one more time. The very last thing to do was tack the waistband to the dress in a few more places, and then I was finished. I think the dress came out pretty close to the original, and on the whole I'm really happy. I do have a few things I'd change if I were to make it again, mostly with the undergarments. They're constantly slipping off my shoulders because of how far the dress sits, and it's kind of difficult keeping them all hidden at the straps. I thought the sleeves on the bodice petticoat would help hold out the sleeves on the final dress, but they're just extra bulk and another thing to keep from slipping into view. The back looks a little funny, that's on me when putting on the dress. If both hooks at the waist were properly secured and I'd tied the top edge correctly, I think the effect would be really cool. And the stays extended slightly above the petticoat, which isn't ideal, but I love the movement in the skirt and the transparency of the fabric. Unfortunately, you can't see my Regency hairstyle because I have black hair, but I curled my entire head loosely in heatless curls, wrapped the bangs separately in pillow rollers, then made a high ponytail and pinned my hair in standing pin curls into a bun. I'm more proud of that than I should be, honestly. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. I mostly do vintage sewing, so if you'd like to see that, feel free to subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.